So, if you could communicate with an extraterrestrial species, what's the first question you'd ask them about life in the universe and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think much like thinking about communicating with other species on our planet, language itself is going to be extremely difficult. Wittgenstein posited, language is so complex and unique to not just our species, the language that we use, but also like our cultural backgrounds and the context and how our brains process. And so, assuming we could have a conversation with an alien civilization to begin with and actually talk with them, I think one of my first questions, given that they most likely will have some very different biological, technological developments than what we've had, I'd love to know how they see the universe. So much as when you meet another person, like one of the best things to find out about another person is how they see things, like you can talk about a story that you've both read, or if you're in a romantic relationship, you can say like, how do you feel love? Like what makes you feel caring and compassion? The same thing happens, I think, for talking to alien life. I'd love to know like how do you perceive the universe?
There was a great film, controversial film maybe called Arrival, which detailed exactly this. So, they were trying to use their language and try to figure out how they communicate. Would it be that simplistic? Like, did Hollywood kind of crack it, or would it be much more complex? I know people think that math could be that one linkage. Is there anything else that could be that linkage?
Yeah, a lot to unfold there as well. It's like my friend Sarah Walker, who is a wonderful physicist and astrobiologist, has said before that mathematics is not the language of the universe, it's the language with which we understand the universe. And there might be some differences mathematically in how we have perceived the universe and used this language to understand. And aliens might have, there should be some things that are consistent, but there might be some things that are so different that even using mathematics to have a conversation might be exceedingly difficult, especially depending on their perception and their understanding of time. And that goes to Arrival. I love the film Arrival. It's wonderful. It's actually based on a short story by Ted Chiang, who is a wonderful author called Story of Your Life. And the beauty of the story, it's not so focused on the aliens. In the story, it's more focused on the concept of time. And how would you speak to someone if you already knew their entire lifespan and future, including how you play into that future? And I love that idea, and I love that he used the alien concept then. And we see this in the film, the aliens, they have such a different perception of time that even their language is different. So right now, as I'm speaking, my brain is sending me information to continue this sentence on. And I could talk forever. I could keep doing this. We have an infinite language where we can just continue talking nonstop, and I don't quite know where it's going to end. But I love in the story of Arrival and in Story of Your Life, the aliens have such a different understanding of time that when they start the sentence, they know exactly where it's going to end. And so their idea of language is not linear, it's this circular kind of full time loop of understanding. And that might be the case. There are other beings on our planet who experience time somewhat differently than we do. The same way, so I have a young son, a young child here at home. The number of days that he's experienced so far in his life are much, much less, much fewer than I have. And so for him, a single day feels a lot longer than it does for me because I've experienced so very many of them over the course of my life. And if you speak to someone, who's 100 years old, one single day for them is an extremely small proportion of their total life. But here on Earth, we have other creatures who experience time differently. Mayflies live their entire adult lives in 24 hours, and then they're gone. We have bristlecone pine trees like Methuselah out here in the western US, who has lived over 5,000 years and has a much different perspective of time and what it's experienced in the universe. And so I think it's very likely, if and when we meet aliens, that there'll be some differences in how we perceive things like time, the movement of space around us, sense perception, like chemical reception, like smell. Maybe they have hearing of different forms than what we do. Maybe they have different kinds of sight than what we do. I think those little differences will make for very large differences in how we communicate.
Speaking of Dr. Sarah Amari Walker, I believe, she brought up what was called the shadow biosphere. Do you have anything to say about that? Because that's such a fascinating topic and concept, but it's such an unknown thing. So we can take a
Um,
tangent if you'd like.
yeah, the concept is pretty cool. So Carol Cleland, who's a friend of mine, she's a great philosopher at CU Boulder. She, along with others like Chris Chiba and some, have pushed out this idea or posited this idea of the shadow biosphere, that there could be some form of life on Earth that is so different from life as we know it that it's here and we're not even seeing it. Now, this most likely wouldn't be like a large scale, multicellular giant animal-like creature, even though they know who knows what's on the ocean floor or deep in the crust, for instance. It seems unlikely. What they were suggesting is maybe there are some biological processes, perhaps being conducted by individuals or just by a biological structure that is doing something, but we don't recognize it because it's not using RNA and DNA or the same kind of proteins or the things that we generally look for. It's not as well accepted because there's just not as much evidence for it. But there are a few interesting things happening, like geologically, chemically on our planet that we haven't fully explained yet. So one of their best examples is desert varnish. So if you go out, into the American West or, go to Namibia or the Sahara, various deserts around our planet, you'll see that there's these varnishes, these rock coatings that form on a lot of the rocks in deserts in these very dry, high sun environments. And there are some hypotheses for both geological and biological processes that we know of to form this varnish, but some of the chemistry of the varnish is still unexplained. And so one of their key examples for the shadow biosphere might be that this desert varnish is being driven by some kind of small life form or biological process that we don't know yet, that don't know about yet.
One of the things about looking for life out there is also kind of looking at life here. And we see lots of examples of what are called extremophiles. I'd love to get your interpretation of extremophiles and then also ask, do extremophiles kind of make it clear that there is life out there, or are we jumping too ahead by coming to that conclusion too quickly?
Yeah. So the concept of extremophile comes from the history of the science of us learning about them. Long ago we thought most life was like us. Most things were plants and animals and fungi. Then we developed the microscope and we learned that the world is covered in microbes and that we have microbes inside of us, on our skin, inside of our bodies. We've discovered that there are viruses out there. But not only that, we've discovered that life can live in some extremes relative to how we humans live. And so currently on the Earth, there are some organisms that thrive in hot spring environments, deep in the ocean floor. They thrive in glacial ice in the Arctic and Antarctica. There are creatures that can survive being lofted high into the atmosphere and then have their spores blown around the planet. There are some creatures that can survive being exposed to the space environment on the outside of the space station. We've done these exposure experiments with tardigrades and things like that. And so it is important to remember that the concept of extremophile is extreme relative to us. And so, we kind of live in a very clement, nice place on the planet. We can't take things too hot or too cold. We need a certain amount of oxygen in our air to breathe. And so, extremophiles in our modern day, these are the things that live well outside of the range of life as most other living things. But they also teach us about the limits of life. They teach us how hot life might be able to withstand high temperatures and how cold, how much salt or lack of salt, how much water or lack of water, how much radiation might life be able to withstand. They don't inherently tell us that there is alien life out there, but by discovering these extremophiles and exploring them over the last several decades, it started expanding our view of what's possible for life to fill, not just environments and ecosystems like we have right now in modern day Earth, but also for alien environments. And then just one more tangent on that. I was clear in the very beginning that these are extreme relative to us, but if you start going back through the history of life on Earth, we ourselves are extremophiles relative to other creatures that have existed in time. Early on in Earth's history of life, no living thing was breathing oxygen or producing oxygen. And so those of us who are oxygen breathers today, we are very much the extremophiles compared to the early life of Earth. It wasn't until roughly 2.7 to 2.5 billion years ago that life figured out how to produce oxygen. In the process, not only did it oxygenate our atmosphere and allow for things like us to start using oxygen, which is very powerful for metabolism, it also killed a lot of other life forms. And so sometimes extremophiles come around, they take over and they fill a niche, and then they destroy everything else, just like an invasive species you can think of. There have been many of these examples through time. There's actually a really great book by Peter Ward called The Medea Hypothesis. It's kind of a counter idea to the Gaia hypothesis. So James Lovelock famously, along with Lynn Margulis and others, kind of proposed this idea of like Earth as a superorganism of Gaia, and that Gaia, that life itself promotes the future evolution of more life on a world. But as Peter points out in his book, sometimes life does exactly what I mentioned, where new life comes about, fills an ecosystem or a niche, and kills everything else. And that's actually happened several times in Earth's
Oh
history.
gosh. What one thing that people are probably just banging their heads on is what do you do for a living? What is your field? It's a very interesting field and you speak with such passion and such rigor, but what is that field of astrobiology? What do you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, astrobiology is a huge realm of human study. It's not a single discipline. And so we have various disciplines that come into astrobiology from science and engineering and philosophy and humanities and other realms. So for myself, I started off studying in university biology and chemistry. I then shifted over to astrophysics and then earned a PhD in geology. And all four of those disciplines are involved in this realm of astrobiology. But it's also inclusive of philosophy, philosophy of science, lots of realms of just asking big questions about what life is, if we can define life or not, if we can define intelligence or consciousness. But there's also a lot of other realms that come into this bigger pursuit to understand the nature of life in the universe. And for me, as a young kid, I just always wanted to be involved in the big questions, looking for answers, being humble enough to accept the answers that we get, but then also brave enough to ask bigger questions beyond what we know. And so astrobiology has allowed me to do that in many ways. As far as my career goes, I'm no longer, I am a research scientist still, and I do some research, but now I'm far more focused in the realm of science communication, in writing regularly. So I write a little bit every day. I'm publishing articles in various places and working on some other projects right now. I also have a rather large group at the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. I have several visiting scholars who are working with me in a variety of projects, some related to self-transcendent experiences and space psychology. Others are working in realms like studying extremophile biology and how that might apply to space exploration. And so we do a lot of different things in my group. A lot of it, though, is focused kind of on just the research, the reading, the writing, and what these things can, how we can make things better for everyone in the future and better understanding these things. But I also do communications and marketing for the nonprofit Blue Marble Space, which oversees BMSIS. And so as a PhD student, I never thought I'd get involved in nonprofit business and do things like communications and marketing, but here I am, like I learned a lot along the way about like social media networking and doing a lot of networking at meetings and stuff like that. And I loved talking to people. And because of that, I ended up being pretty good at communicating about what we all do.
Yeah, no, it shows that you love talking to people and that love talking about what you're passionate about. That absolutely shows. What you talked about a big question, which is what life is. And immediately people think, well, if we find intelligent life or signs of intelligence in the universe, then that's it. We know we're not alone. The kind of a more interesting question to me, at least, is what would constitute finding life? So if we went to Mars or the oceans of Europa or Io or Callisto, and we found microbial life, would that be as big of a discovery as, let's say, ancient ruins? There's kind of like a spectrum of finding life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a spectrum, and there's a lot of changes in how people view the impact of a detection of life in those cases. Yeah, so say we go to Mars and we find signs of not even extant life, not current life, but extinct ancient microbial life from Mars, maybe roughly 4 billion years ago, in some surface rock from Mars, maybe that we've returned to Earth. Even though myself and many astrobiologists would think that's profound, it's a huge discovery about the nature of life in the universe. It would tell us a lot. I think a lot of people wouldn't be as excited about that. But say we do find some signs of like perhaps maybe an ancient alien artifact, even in our own solar system, much like in Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel or 2001: A Space Odyssey, where there's, this device left on the moon for humans to one day find, should we be technologically advanced enough? It seems far-fetched and it is science fiction, but it is possible. There is some realm of possibility that maybe some advanced species has visited our solar system. If we found some actual alien artifact or even had aliens show up tomorrow, which that could be both good and absolutely terrifying. But say it happened, I think that would be a much different impact for everyone. Um, the same thing as like receiving like a radio message from space, or seeing some kind of message playing out, some non-random pattern from some starlight perhaps being flashed out into the cosmos. Those things suggesting intelligent civilizations out there for a lot of people are far more impactful. But I honestly, I would hope that most people can understand that should we find any signs of other life out there, definitive, sufficient signs of alien life, that alone would tell us so much about our place in the universe.
Speaking of finding life, it feels like we're taking a step back, but I do want to ask because you speak very deeply about these things. Would it be a benefit in the sense of, I know there was a paper published by Nick Bostrom a handful of years ago with one of the titles of which is like, Why I Hope Our Search for Life in the Universe Yields No Result, or something like that. To which I encourage people to read it, but he says he hopes that we don't find anything, not even alien artifacts or whatever, because if we do, it would designate that the Great Filter is in front of us. I would love to ask you just to have you explain it. Well, what's the Great Filter, and why do you agree with his position?
Yeah, so Bostrom is a great philosopher. I'm actually reading his Superintelligence book right now. It's a wonderful read. I don't agree with him, but I understand where he's coming from. Not just because of the possibility of the Great Filter being in front of us, but also for the possibility of the range of possible civilizations that could be out there. Some of our hypotheses about why we haven't heard from life and from alien life yet, for instance, among them are some rather scary potentials. There could be the potential that alien life, that there could be life forms or even post-biological civilizations that are now AI and robotics driven that have reason to want to destroy other civilizations. And so that might be part of that filter as well. But stepping back, the concept of the great filter or of great filters in general is that there might be these bottlenecks that life has to step through if it's lucky enough to survive them. So, major events, for instance, in Earth's past, have been genetic bottlenecks for us. They've been moments that we almost didn't survive. Not only the rise of oxygen killing off a bunch of stuff in the oceans early on, but we've had things like planetary impacts. None of them has been sufficient enough to wipe out all of life as we know it. Life has always survived through these changes, but it has altered our evolution, for better or for worse, in various ways. It's allowed us to come around, for instance. It's led to the demise of other creatures, though. And there are other changes that could happen. Say, like, a giant supernova going off near a star system could eradicate life on its surface. But also, we're in this age now where we are quite aware of the existential threats, not just from space and from our environment, but that we have created for ourselves. So not just things like the potential for creating new pathogens or creating a new pandemic through biological warfare and terrorism. We also still have tens of thousands of amassed nuclear warheads on this planet, and only a small number of those would be sufficient to wipe out our species. Again, it might not eradicate life as we know it unless we launch all of them, but it could definitely be a filter for us that we're passing through this stage of an early civilization where warfare is still rampant amongst our species. And we see that today across the world. There's still war everywhere, there's oppression everywhere. There's still a lot of suffering in human civilization that's being driven by other humans. And we haven't overcome that. We might never overcome that, but I hope that we will. I hope that's part of our filter is that we'll get through that. But there are also other possible things that can happen in the near future or the far future. Amongst them right now is the potential threats along with promises of AGI. So as AI is evolving right now and it's evolving so rapidly, we're developing it so quickly, there is the potential that in the very near future we might develop AGI. We might even put it inside of humanoid robots or other forms of robots. And so, we've seen in science fiction over and over again the ideas of like Skynet and Terminator and these ideas of like, a massive AI coming around. I personally love video games, and so like Horizon Zero Dawn, I love the idea of just like the billionaire who thinks he's doing a great job making all these military weapons and giving them AGI, not being aware that he's actually just set up humans to die entirely by having the AGI eradicate them. Um, there's stories we tell ourselves about this possibility, and it's not all bad. There's actually a lot of great things that could come for us through these developments of AI and AGI. But one possibility is that the lifetime of a biological civilization is capped towards the end by its development of a technology that surpasses it. And we might be in that realm as well. And so, if we were to find signs of an advanced alien civilization, a signal, an artifact, or anything like that, yes, it would suggest that there could be a filter ahead of us, especially if we find something that appears to be a sign of like a dead civilization that's out there, or a civilization that came and left some sign and then disappeared. Those things might be more terrifying. But also, we have the fear that if we find signs of an alien civilization, it might be too late for our species to protect ourselves. So perhaps we're not evolving fast enough and working together well enough to be prepared should there be a civilization or a being or something out there that wishes to cause us harm.
Yeah, I do want to kind of go back on a tangent and take a step even further back because there is this assumption that we've had that I unfortunately put out, which is that there is life in the universe. And that is also a big question, which feels moot at this point, but we should still ask it. So the Drake equation, obviously, there are many variables that go into it. It was updated very recently with the Seeger equation, which I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know Dr. Sarah Seeger gave her updated version. Are these the correct frameworks to be using to calculate whether there is life in the universe? And what do they tell us?
Great question. I'll start by saying that that's not what the Drake equation is. So the Drake equation, so Frank Drake, he's now passed away, was a young astronomer in 1960 when he organized a meeting of other scientists, including a young Carl Sagan and other researchers from across the realm of biology and chemistry and physics, and mostly focused on astronomy and primarily radio astronomy. And his idea was he wanted to get people together and have a conversation of what do we need to know right now if we're going to find a communicating alien civilization out there with our radio telescopes. And so the equation itself was actually kind of the setup of the meeting. It was that, these are the things we need to know to figure out if we're alone. And it just turns out Drake was very thoughtful when he structured this equation that it's a thought experiment. And so every now and then someone publishes a paper claiming that they have some exact number or range of numbers for the Drake equation. That's always wrong. We have no way to answer that to solve that equation right now. Specifically, there certainly is an answer, but we cannot know it, and there's no way for us to compute it at all right now. I recall like sometime back there was people that came out suggesting I think 37 civilizations based on some analysis of the equation, but those researchers have no idea what they're talking about because at the end of the day, some of the factors of the Drake equation are things we just cannot currently know. So the equation itself, the big N of the equation, the output, is the number of civilizations right now in the Milky Way galaxy with whom we can communicate via radio telescopes. And so it's not necessarily saying that there is life out there or not. It's just saying, are there other civilizations right now that we can talk to? And then within the factors of the equation, you start with a rather, kind of a large number or a large realm of numbers, depending on the times that you're using. You start off with the formation of new stars per year to get like basically a rough analysis of how many stars are you thinking about. From there, you start breaking down that number of possible stellar systems to try to figure out where a civilization would be. So of those stars, you're looking at like the fraction of those stars that have planets. We now think that's one. Almost every star, to our knowledge, or on average, will have at least one planet or more. Um, but then after that, we start having a harder time. So like then we go to Earth-like planets in a solar system. The number of Earth-like planets that have an origin of life, which we have no idea if that's possible outside of ours. How many worlds that have life will have created intelligent life? From that, how many have created radio communication? And then on top of that, the equation then factors out to be unitless once you include the lifetime of a civilization, the L factor, the very last factor of the equation. And so it is a framework for trying to assess, not just thinking about, who might be out there right now. It's a framework for thinking about what we know and don't know. And some things we do have a good handle on. We can look with our telescopes into the universe and we can look around the galaxy and get a rough estimate of the number of stars forming per year or per millennium or per million years. Again, we've already looked in some very small, limited places in our galaxy, and we're seeing planets everywhere. We have over 5,000 known planets now, and so that suggests that roughly on average, every star has at least one or more planets. Um, but after that, we don't really have as much information. We don't know how many Earth-like worlds there are around those other stars. We don't even know if Earth-like worlds are required for origins of life. Maybe life is more common on worlds that aren't like the Earth. So it's very presumptive to assume that Earth-like worlds are even necessary in the first place. Again, we have no idea if life originated any other time besides here. Some of us think it's probably likely, but we just don't know. And then on top of that, how many times does like a biosphere develop our level of intelligence or a different level of intelligence? Who creates technologies that allow them to communicate via radio waves? Would they even be compelled to? There's are things we just don't know. And then the lifetime of a civilization, it's very poignant in 1960 to add that to the equation because we were very aware of our potential existential threat from our nuclear warheads at that point. But we also, again, like we might create a post-biological civilization very soon. So maybe for us, the L factor is actually very short. Maybe it's only 10,000 years or so because we're just about on that next cusp of creating the next civilization.
Yeah, the unknown is so interesting. I know in the Little Book of Aliens by Dr. Adam Frank, he talked about this type of planet that we had no clue even existed, like between one Earth or a couple of Earth masses to just underneath Saturn. So he analogized it with like seeing an animal in the forest and never having seen that animal in your life and telling someone about it and them saying, yeah, that's the most common animal in the world. And just that planet is almost everywhere. It's in like 80% of solar systems as that we think of. Speaking of planets, exoplanets. What are the studies of exoplanets? Because it feels like I was listening to Dr. David Kipping on the Lex Friedman podcast, and he was saying that like the industry of exoplanets, if you will, was like super um, not respected, let's say, and then immediately, very recently, it became all the rage as we discovered more and more and more. How has our understanding of exoplanets changed, and are there any really interesting ones that you find?
Yeah. I will say David's a little bit older than me, and so he might have a better personal experience of that happening. So when the first exoplanets were found in 1992, and then the first world around a main sequence type star in 1995, I was still fairly young back then. So I never had a perspective of the field being in any way judgmental of exoplanets. If anything, from the scientists I've known, so even like, Carl Sagan and others, who were around long before that period, doing research, they spoke often about the possibility of other worlds out there. If we look back in human history, ancient humans from long ago were thinking about the possibility of other worlds like our own around those other stars out there. And so even though, we didn't have the Copernican system developed until a little bit later in human civilization, very early on, humans were wondering, are those lights in the sky other stars? Are they other places where there might be other worlds? Giordano Bruno famously was someone who thought about the possibility for these worlds to exist. And so I've never experienced exoplanets a realm of astrophysics being kind of on the fringe or pushed out. In my own time of development, I've noticed it actually growing remarkably in the number of worlds we know about and the number of researchers who are intrigued by it and want to work in that realm. So most of my friends who I went to graduate school with around the same time and our colleagues and our cohort, a lot of them were excited for things like the James Webb Space Telescope and other observatories we're working on right now, other upcoming telescopes for looking at these exoplanets. And so in my own time, I've just seen it blossom and grow ever more, and it has been incredible. We have found a few exoplanets, for instance, close, and you're kind of like looking towards the center of our galaxy. There's one possible finding of an exoplanet in another galaxy, even though that's still kind of hotly debated. But most of the exoplanets we found are all within a very small region of space around our own solar system. And so those 5,000 plus planets are actually a lot of worlds to tell us that chances are our entire galaxy is populated with hundreds of billions, and personally, I think probably maybe even a trillion planets is possible.
Where does your mind even go with that? Like there has to be life there, and we're always looking for technosignatures. We're always looking at, I forget, a transit of a planet in front of the star. And we also look, I remember in A Thousand Brains Theory by Jeff Hawkins, Richard Dawkins wrote the foreword, and he was talking about that we need to create like a Dyson sphere or a Dyson swarm to tell everybody else that if we end up eradicating ourselves, humans were still here. And similarly,
Mhm.
looking at the Kardashev scale, when we reach type 2, or if we reach type 2, or if any other civilization has reached type 2, they would have built some type of kind of, not stellar engine, but technology to harvest energy from the sun. But to our knowledge, that we haven't discovered that yet. And it feels like technosignatures also advance. I know Dr. David Kipping was talking about like canals on Mars as being, or the what was thought to be canals on Mars as the advanced technosignature at the time. How has our search for technosignatures evolved? I guess we just discussed that, but what is the most up-to-date science or philosophy or biggest questions around technosignatures right now? It feels like we're going to transcend into post-biological life.
Possibly. We might, or it might be some other thing that happens. Maybe we will become a biological but advanced species by incorporating AGI. Maybe BCIs, these brain computer interfaces. Maybe we'll augment our bodies through gene editing. There's a lot of possibilities that do include humans in the future. And so even though, I've suggested the possibility that we eradicate ourselves or replace ourselves with our AGI, it is very possible that we will be part of that human future. Or maybe like in Dune by Frank Herbert, maybe we'll have some rising up against AGI and fight them and choose to live a different human biological future. So there's a lot of possibility there. But for technosignatures, you're right. This idea of like canals on Mars. David Barron has a book coming out here this summer, exploring this idea of the Martians in the early 1900s, especially from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. This idea that like it was in a lot of Western nations in the U.S. and the UK and some other places, like it was just accepted that there were human-like beings. There were little green men or human-like beings on Mars and Venus and other worlds. And I love watching old sci-fi from like the 40s and 50s because they seem to think that like space one they're always breathing in space and they can go to every single planet and walk on every single planetary surface and every world has its own population of human-like beings. Um, Now we've changed our views a lot of the possible population of our own solar system, let alone other star systems out there. And so a lot has changed, but technosignatures as a realm of biosignatures is definitely a growing field. So in Frank Drake's time, in the Drake equation, when he wrote that in 1960, at that point, it was very young, this realm of SETI, of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And a lot of people were just thinking, the main technology that we have that would most likely be the best for us to communicate, but also for us to receive messages was in radio waves using radio telescopes. And radio very easily passes through the cosmos, these very long EM waves. But as it's grown, one, we've started looking in a lot more regions of radio. We've also started looking in other regions, like in infrared and X-rays and even invisible light, doing things like OSETI or optical search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so the field has grown a lot, not just in what we're looking for, but also how we're thinking about how other civilizations might have intelligence and might develop technologies that we can see. So some people, like my colleague Jacob Hawk-Misra, has done remarkable work thinking about like, can we see industrial gases being produced on an exoplanet? Would that be a sign of technology if they're creating civilization and producing things like the CFCs and stuff like that we've made? But also, like, could it be messages that they're trying to send out into space to make contact? Could it be other signals? And so you mentioned like the Kardashev scale, this idea of like the energy transitions of different civilizations, and we humans aren't even a type 1 civilization yet. Some call us a zero point 0.5, and it's kind of hard to actually factor because it's more of a qualitative thought experiment, this idea that Nikolai Kardashev came up with. But say there is a type 2 civilization out there, might we see them capturing their starlight by building a Dyson sphere around their star, building some giant mega constellation or mega structure around their star? That happened famously recently with Tabby's star. Is a star we were looking at where some people wondered, like, so they saw like this brightening and dimming of the star that couldn't be explained by exoplanet science alone. And so at first, one of the possible hypotheses was maybe there's some giant like halo-like rings around the star that some alien civilization has built. It's rather agreed upon now. It's most likely like dust, like a giant Kuiper belt full of dust, or perhaps an exoplanet that was ripped apart. but the possibility is still on the table that it could be a mega constellation of some form. And also there's even some folks out there who are wondering. So there's a group, and I'm forgetting the name right now. I think it's a VAST, maybe Vanishing Astronomy Sources. Um, they're looking to see, based on old data that we have in our archives from various observatories, have we observed stars in the galaxy that have since then winked out of existence because someone has built a Dyson sphere around it? I'm not sure where they are with that. I don't think they found anyone yet, but it is possible that maybe some of the first signs of an advanced civilization we might find out there is a civilization that's choosing to gobble up stars or cover them in Dyson spheres. And so that's also rather terrifying for a few reasons because we are not there yet technologically. And so maybe we need to stop fighting each other and stop our bickering and all these stupid things we do and start planning for a much longer term future. Humans, we tend to be short term thinkers, especially culturally right now around the world, given our politics and how we act. We think on very short term timescales, days, weeks, months, maybe a year or two, often not more than a few years. And some civilizations might be thinking on the millennial timescale or the eon timescale, and maybe we need to start planning a bit better for that.
Do you think the discovery of life elsewhere in the universe would bring us together, or would it perpetuate these differences? Because I want to believe, I don't mean to be glass half empty, but I want to believe that finding life on Europa would be this incredible moment of, wow, we're so small in the universe. It's not just us, which I want to say something more about later. And we would come together and start, kind of like Pacific Rim, just building stuff and being the whole civilization. But then the kind of more pessimistic side of me immediately says, well, that would just kind of encourage more nations to go and do their own thing and try to be the first to get to that life or first to get to that exoplanet or moon. What are your thoughts on this? Am I just being youthfully pessimistic?
It could be both, but I'll also add in my own fear and my own concern. So as someone who thinks a lot about astrobiology, and I love science fiction and thinking about how this detection of alien life, be it microbial or finding a signal from space, which could be more impactful, how that might cause us to want to work together. And it is hopeful, it is optimistic to think that if we made this detection, one, it would tell us that we're not alone. It would also tell us that there could be threats out there that we need to be better prepared for, but it also would give us more reason to want to go explore even more. And I would hope that we could do that together. But you're right, there's a more pessimistic side of it that it can scare people. So I'm working in this realm right now, trying to explore different ways that people are impacted by thinking about aliens. Some people are very optimistic. Some people feel pro-social behaviors when they start thinking about the possibility for alien life out there. They want to be more compassionate, more concerned, more forward-thinking and thoughtful. But some people are impacted in a different way. They feel insignificant. They feel terrified and scared. They feel small. They feel the need to defend themselves. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for these variations in how we are impacted by thinking about alien life. But in science fiction and in various media, we've seen this idea, that a detection of alien life or a signal from space might cause some people in various like religious groups or various belief systems to become very upset and want to fight or destroy themselves or destroy others. Um, but my bigger concern is that so for like say we find an alien signal or a spaceship comes to Earth. I think that's going to smack everyone in the face and make us all do something. But say we find signs of life in the European Ocean or signs of ancient life from Mars, or even just some signal from space, from an exoplanet maybe that there is a biosphere possible, or even maybe a technosphere possible, but we can't really communicate or talk with them yet or touch them yet. I have a bigger concern that a lot of people aren't going to care. Like where we are right now, a lot of people are very, very attached to the 24-hour news cycle, to quick dopamine hits on their smartphones and their computers and their video games. We as a civilization are kind of losing touch with a greater level of connection to the cosmos and to each other. And I have this concern right now that say we do have like tomorrow some group of scientists comes out with a definitive sufficient indicator of a biosphere on an exoplanet. I'm concerned that I think a lot of people will be interested and talk about it for a few days or weeks or months, and then I'm afraid it would fizzle out and disappear in the continual news cycle that we have, because I think a lot of people are very indifferent to these large scale changes, even when they impact us greatly. And a great example of that is the current realm of climate change happening on our planet. I remember as a kid back in the early 90s, the late 80s, like, people were talking about these big changes that might come by the year 2050. And it's 2025, and those changes are here and now, and they're already happening. And yet there's a lot of people who are indifferent to it for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's political. There are a lot of political motivations to not address the change of our world, and how it is suggesting to us we should change our activities and behaviors. But some people, I think, are just so indifferent because we think on a short time scale. We're not thinking on longer term time scales. We need long term futuristic thinking, and we need it now.
How do we incentivize is a horrible word. How do we inspire or encourage people, young and old, to adopt that? Maybe a millennium is too much, or too big of a stretch, but maybe a year-long thinking or decade-long thinking, or maybe a better term is civilizational thinking instead of individual thinking. Have you come to any conclusions about this, or do you have any pathways for people to explore?
Mhm. So that there are differences already on our planet in like individualistic versus collectivistic nations, and socioeconomical and political ways that we've gone about our lives. But on the whole, we as a species have not been thinking on the long-term timescales like we could be. Ways to inspire that could be through things like finding alien life. I'd hope that might help to inspire some longer term thinking. Sadly, sometimes it does take having a fire lit under your butt to make you get up and do something. And so, much like with climate change right now, like we're seeing a much greater amount of wildfires out here in the American West, burning down forests and now damaging lots of properties and impacting lives. And that's driving more people who see it to think more actively about the change of our climate and the change of our world, how weather patterns are changing. And the truth is, we don't know where the future of climate and climate science is going to go. It might continue getting worse. It might go the other way and get extremely cold. There's a lot of things that could happen in the future for our planet. We do know that there is a point when the balances tip and a world experiences a runaway greenhouse effect. We see that on Venus. Venus now is a hellscape at its surface because it had a runaway greenhouse effect. And we don't know if our current behaviors are driving that on our planet. I'd hope not. But sometimes seeing these changes for some people helps them to better frame it. The same way that I think if we did have any kind of finding of alien life out there, it might help people to better understand this need for longer term thinking. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, as a species, we just did not evolve to think on these grander scales. And maybe it's AGI or AI that's going to help us to start realizing this of ourselves, that we do need better long-term thinking.
Speaking of the question of what is life, do you think that life can be post-biological, or is that just a different type of thing?
Yeah. So the idea of life, like, we use this term a lot in my science. I mean, we explore life, but we don't actually know what life is. There is no single definition or structure that says, like, if we find something alien out there, that this is life. There's one kind of accepted realm of a possible definition that life is a self-contained chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. But I guess Sarah Walker does a fantastic job breaking down in her recent book, that definition itself is very lacking. There's a lot of problems with that definition, and actually we've had over 300 attempted definitions in the scientific literature for life, and every single one of them is in some manner flawed or lacking. It might be missing things. And one place that we often miss out on is this concept of artificial life. If we are creating AI right now, say tomorrow we create AGI, is that a life form? Like, at what point does it become alive? Even if it's a created life form, even if it's something that we have developed ourselves and created, at what point do we consider it alive? Does it have to have some form of sentience? There's a lot of living things on the earth that don't have sentience as we think about it often. Um, does it have to be some form of intelligence? I mean, certainly there's various levels of intelligence all around our planet already. And so, personally, for me, I think that any kind of post-biological life that we create, AGI that we create, the thing that comes after us, even if it includes part of what we are now, I don't think humans in our current form will persist for that much longer. I think we are going to change ourselves drastically, and hopefully we'll be along for the ride and not just destroy ourselves. But I think in the grand view of cosmic evolution in the universe, from the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, from those earliest processes occurring of, atoms forming, electrons getting structured where they attach to these nuclei and form the atoms and light is released. There's been a long-term lineage, a long-term process of physical, of cosmic evolution that has then led to geological, planetary scale evolution of materials that then itself led to biological evolution. Life, as we know it, originated somewhere, maybe on the Earth, maybe it came here. Life happened and it's now evolved through time, and we are just one piece of that very long lineage. And so anything that we create and that becomes aware of itself or alive is just another piece of that long lineage, that long tapestry of evolution in the cosmos.
So we haven't, unfortunately, recreated abiogenesis yet. Do you subscribe to panspermia or do you subscribe to like a biogenesis on Earth? Or can it be a
Yeah.
combination of both?
Yeah, I think it could be a combination of both. We really don't know yet. It does seem like life, most likely, as we know it, originated here. The reason for that just being the timing. It seems like as soon as life was able to originate on Earth, it did. If it was panspermia, it seems like it could have happened at any point. The Earth could have been here for millions of years, or hundreds of millions of years, or billions of years before life came to us from a rock from space. But so for panspermia, this idea of seeds everywhere, it's a very intriguing concept. And we do have a lot of good science to suggest that living things could survive inside of rocks, for instance, being transited through space. There's even potential that some organisms might survive very well themselves, just as biological creatures being transported through space. But panspermia does not preclude an origin of life. So even with panspermia, you still have to have life start somewhere. And some people like to argue that maybe panspermia means life started in another star system or elsewhere in our galaxy and then came here on a rock. That seems rather unlikely, again, because of timing. So, in our early solar system, there certainly most likely were, just as there are now, interstellar objects coming in from elsewhere in the galaxy. But honestly, for me, I think the more likely thing, if there was a panspermia event that led to life here, is that life might have started on Venus or on Mars and then through an impact been brought here. And so I would think that if that were the case, then there might be some potential for us to find some ancient signs of life on Mars, maybe on Venus. It's questionable because the surface again is extremely hot and roughly 500 million years ago or so. We're not entirely sure, but it seems like the entire surface of Venus melted, and we don't know if there's any sign of ancient rock there at all for us to look at. Um, but I love the concept of panspermia as an idea. And what the future of panspermia might be. Maybe in the future, us or whatever comes after us will choose to send spacecraft bearing life to other worlds out there, which that itself is also kind of a panspermia event, even if it's intentional and it's directed. It would still be a form of panspermia as well.
Like a von Neumann probe would could be panspermia as well. That's interesting.
Yeah, like we could send a bunch of them out and have them carrying some, like this is the life seed, and there's like a bunch of organisms or some structure that it just drops all over worlds to see if life takes off. It's quite possible, and if we could do it, then maybe an alien civilization long ago chose to do it too.
Yeah, then we get into the realm of Prometheus and the engineers and everything. I have a question just to geek out with you. Is there not a substantial danger when interacting with alien life due to bacterial cross-contamination? Like, if we, let's say, just for the sake of ease, find life on Mars, for example, and there also was a movie about this called Life with Jake Gyllenhaal and Ryan Reynolds. Wouldn't we always be at risk of transporting like civilization-ending microbes back to our home and having them spread like an invasive species? Like, it feels like whenever we think about life, we never think about like the intricacies of our biology with that.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, so this has been around as an idea since like the Andromeda strain by Michael Crichton. This idea, like, and it's why we have planetary protection now at NASA, and it's why we not only sterilize as best we can. We can't fully sterilize, but we try our best to clean our spacecraft so that we're not sending Earth life to other worlds. That's forward contamination. So sending life as we know it out on our spacecraft to other worlds. Usually we try to avoid that. Not always. There's been like the Beresheet lander that crashed on the moon, had a bunch of tardigrades on board intentionally. We do send life out intentionally sometimes. Um, but generally, we're trying to avoid contamination of another world for astrobiology, for one reason, because we want to see if there is other life out there. And if we contaminate with our own life, then we might never know. But also to avoid eradicating another biosphere. Say life as we know it could take off and just destroy other creatures. Um, then we also have the backward contamination issue, and that's where the Andromeda strain idea comes in, and this idea of bringing alien life back to Earth and how impactful that might be. Now, we don't know. We don't know if we meet an alien civilization or we find an alien microbe on Mars, how that might interact with our biology. If we have a similar origin of life, so say life started on Earth and went to Mars, or life started on Mars and came to Earth through panspermia events, if we have a shared origin and a shared lineage of some form, then it might be far more likely for us to impact each other negatively because we might share some of the same biological mechanisms and apparatus that then is competing directly. But if it's a truly alien being with a different origin, it has different resource requirements and things like that, it might not compete with us very much at all. It might not be competitive in any way whatsoever with us. Or it might even be something that just eats us entirely and just devours all of life as we know it. And we really don't know. And that's part of the existential threat of bringing samples back to Earth. And it's part of why we do take such serious measures to try to avoid any possible contamination of alien life.
Absolutely. Well, I do want to wrap up very quickly, so I will ask, what advice do you have for young astrobiologists?
Such a fun question. If you asked me this 5 years ago or 7 years ago, my answer would be very different because things were different back then in our civilization. Right now, artificial intelligence is changing everything. And I think anyone who thinks that the academia, that universities aren't going to be impacted by AI, I think they're very wrong. I think the structure of education itself is going to face rather bizarre and amazing and scary and utterly impactful changes in the near future. And so right now, there's still a great reason to go to university and earn degrees, to join research labs and research teams, to learn the process of science and to learn about philosophy, to ask big, bold questions about our place in the universe. But I think everyone, especially if it's someone, maybe who's like 12 years old right now, needs to be aware that AI is going to change the structure of learning in the future and that it's going to be a crutch for some people, but for some of us, it's a tool. And it's a tool that's going to support even better research, even more learning. It might preclude the need for academic degrees at some point in the future to be involved in this process of astrobiology. I think if people want to do it seriously, though, and they want to be involved and have credibility, then they should at least learn about the rigorous mechanisms of science and how science works as a tool for our own understanding. They should realize that there are charlatans and grifters out there who have their own ideas, but they're not approaching those ideas through science. Their ideas might still have value and are worthy of conversation and discussion, but some of those ideas have not been, or these conclusions have not been reached in any rigorous or scientific manner. And so you have to be very cautious. And AI is going to improve our learning, it's going to improve our education. It's also going to increase the amount of misinformation and uncertainty out there, especially in the internet.
Yeah, that misinformation and uncertainty, and also using AI as a crutch it's one of the things that worries me, but also it should only worry me if we don't have a pathway to get out of it, and we can absolutely build that pathway out of it. It just requires a difference in thinking, and you're absolutely right about that. If you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
Oh my gosh. Our world faces so many problems. I mean, I honestly, my biggest concern right now again is with the short-term thinking of humans. we need to find some way to think on bigger timescales. And one way to get there might be through empathy and compassion and these pro-social behaviors. Roman Krznaric has written a really great book on empathy. He also writes about futuristic thinking and long-term thinking. He wrote a great book called The Good Ancestor, where he talks about how we can be good ancestors to future generations, and part of that is through our empathy and compassion. And so I guess maybe the best way for me to help would be to wave that magic wand and just give everyone just a little tingle of empathy, just a little bit of a pause. And it could be through meditation or psychedelic experiences or just conversations or reading, whatever it is for each person that gives them that pause the next time they judge someone to stop first and just wonder, what is that person's life like? The next time they think about, war and a side, perhaps they're taking a side in one of the current wars in our planet, before doing so, just to have a little bit of empathy and compassion for everyone involved to understand that everything is very intricate, there's nuance, and there's a lot of suffering. From a more Eastern philosophical perspective, a Buddhist perspective, we can do a lot to ease the suffering of this planet, and getting there, one way there is through empathy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's incredible. Just as a last question, what gives you hope in the world?
Hmm. There's so much that we experience in this life that opens our eyes and gives us these transformative experiences from climbing mountains and for me, forest bathing. I love going out in the forest and just walking amongst the trees, spending time with others. I love to have some glasses of whiskey and a good cigar with friends and just talk about life. And those things all give me hope for what the future might hold for all of us. But I think my biggest thing now is now that I'm a father, knowing that I'm part of future generations and seeing the potential for those future generations right now, that gives me hope.
That's incredible. Dr. Lau, thank you so much for being here. Where can we find you online?
Thank you. Yeah, it's cosmobiota.com is my website. I have a Substack newsletter I write on a weekly basis. I write an essay there. It's called The Cosmobiologist. It's at cosmobiota.substack.com. And honestly, I think most people, if they just search for my name, I pop up pretty fast.
Yeah, you absolutely do. Um, Once again, it feels like I say this every time, but this has genuinely been one of my favorite episodes. I really hope to have you back on the program. Thank you so much for talking today.
Thank you.